Carswell Air Force Base, Texas, 1955. A reconnaissance pilot climbs into an RF-84K Thunderflash, and ground crew don't push him toward a runway. They push him under a B-36 Peacemaker, the largest mass-produced piston-engine bomber ever built, 6 turning and 4 burning, a wingspan of 230 feet, and they winch his fighter up into the bomb bay on a hydraulic trapeze until his canopy sits inches from the bomber's belly. The bomb bay doors close around him. He's sealed inside. How did the Air Force end up stuffing a jet fighter into a bomber like a sword into a scabbard? And why did the concept actually work, brilliantly by the numbers, only to get killed anyway? The answer starts with a map and a ruler. Strategic Air Command, in the late 1940s, faced a problem that no amount of courage could solve: distance. The Soviet Union sprawled across 11 time zones. SAC's nuclear strike plans required penetrating deep into that landmass, hitting targets around Moscow, around the Urals, around facilities the CIA could barely locate on a chart. The B-36 could reach those targets, barely. Round-trip combat radius pushed past 3,700 nautical miles with a 10,000-pound bomb load. No other airframe in the American inventory came close, but the B-36 couldn't photograph the targets first. Pre-strike reconnaissance demanded getting low, getting fast, getting pictures, and getting out. The Peacemaker cruised at 230 knots. At altitude, a MiG-15 would close on it like a sprint car running down a tractor. The AC needed eyes over those targets before the bombers went in, and the reconnaissance aircraft that could do the job, the RF-84F Thunderflash, a swept-wing photo recon variant of Republic's sturdy fighter bomber, lacked the range to get there from any base the United States controlled or could plausibly use. Mid-air refueling existed, but remained primitive, unreliable, and limited to a handful of tanker aircraft. General Curtis LeMay, running SAC with the subtlety of a brick through a window, wanted options. The parasite fighter concept landed on his desk. The idea predated the Cold War. The Navy had experimented with hooking biplanes onto the USS Akron and USS Macon in the 1930s, dirigible aircraft carriers, which sounds like fiction, but flew until the airships crashed. The Army Air Forces tried their own version during World War II, mounting a pair of P-85 Goblins under a B-29 in Project MX-10106. The Goblin turned out to be nearly unflyable, a stubby egg of an airplane that test pilot Ed Schock called a bear in the most charitable assessment anyone offered. The whole effort died in 1949. But the range problem didn't die with it, and somebody at Tactical Air Command, the file doesn't name who, proposed trying again with a real airplane instead of a purpose-built novelty. If you've never heard of FICON before, I need you to hit subscribe, because this program sits in a dead zone between aviation history and military folklore, and almost nobody tells it straight. Drop a like, leave a comment if you know something I missed. Some of the best details on programs like this come from people who were there or knew someone who was. The real airplane turned out to be the RF-84K, a Thunderflash modified with a retractable hook on its upper fuselage, just forward of the cockpit. The B-36 got a corresponding trapeze mechanism installed in its forward bomb bay, hydraulically actuated, capable of lowering the fighter into the airstream, releasing it, and then recovering it after the mission. On paper, the arithmetic made sense. The bomber carried the reconnaissance jet to within striking distance of the target. The jet detached at altitude, screamed in at 460 knots, twice the bomber's speed, photographed whatever needed photographing, then climbed back up to meet the mothership and rehooked. The bomber hauled it home. On paper. In practice, the hookup procedure demanded a pilot fly his RF-84K into a precise position beneath a turbulence-spewing 6-engine bomber at roughly 20,000 feet, match speed exactly, and guide a hook on his spine into a receptor he couldn't see, using visual cues from the bomb bay and hand signals from a crewman lying on his stomach inside the B-36 looking down through a glass panel. Crosswinds turned the approach into a wrestling match. Turbulence off the bomber's fuselage could slam the fighter sideways with no warning. The closure rate had to stay under 2 feet per second, or the hook mechanism risked structural failure. Tom Grubaugh, one of the test pilots at Eglin who flew the early trials, remembered the experience decades later. He told an interviewer, "The trickiest part wasn't the flying, it was trusting the hardware." "You're hanging from a hook," he said. "One hook, and you can feel the whole airplane shaking." He wasn't exaggerating about the shaking. A drop tank holds 300 gallons. Bolted under each wing of an F-84E Thunderjet, two of them bought you maybe an extra 400 miles of range. That sounds useful until you measure the distance from Thule, Greenland to Omsk, roughly 3,400 miles one way. The math never closed. Drop tanks couldn't solve the escort gap, and everybody who ran the numbers knew it by 1950. Staged basing came next. Fly escorts part way. Land them at forward airfields in Alaska, Norway, Turkey, refuel, fly the next leg. The problem: those airfields didn't exist in sufficient number, and the ones that did sat within range of Soviet tactical aviation. You'd be fueling your fighters on a runway that MiG-15s could strafe before your pilots finished their coffee. LeMay rejected the concept in a memo that called it logistically untenable. His actual language ran saltier than that, according to staffers who read the original draft. Then came the strange idea: wingtip coupling. Project TomTom, run out of Wright-Patterson in 1950 through 53, physically attached two F-84Es to the wingtips of an EB-29A mothership using articulated clamps. The fighter's engines supplemented the bomber's thrust. Their fuel came from the bomber's tanks via transfer lines. In theory, this extended fighter range to match the bomber's. In practice, the aerodynamic interaction between three joined aircraft created oscillations that no pilot could damp out manually. The name TomTom, incidentally, had nothing to do with drums. It derived from the project's original designation at the Air Materiel Command. Nobody in the declassified paperwork explains where the designation came from. One engineer at Republic Aviation told a historian in the 1980s that it stood for tip-on-tip mating, but that reads like a backronym invented after the fact. Anyway, on April 24, 1953, an EB-29A carrying two RF-84Fs on its wingtips hit Turbulence over Peconic Bay, Long Island. The right-side fighter began rolling uncontrollably. Pilot Lieutenant Colonel Grubaugh, the same Grubaugh who'd later fly FICON hookups, fought the oscillation for seconds before the clamp sheared. His fighter flipped inverted. He ejected. The bomber's right wingtip tore free. Pilot and crew of the EB-29A brought it down with the structural grace of a shopping cart, but they landed it. The smell of hydraulic fluid and scorched aluminum hung over the wreckage site for hours. TomTom died that afternoon. So look at SAC's scorecard. By late 1953, drop tanks couldn't close the range gap. Forward basing put your fighters on runways the Soviets could hit. Wingtip coupling nearly killed two crews and destroyed two airframes in a single afternoon. Every conventional approach to giving the intercontinental bomber a fighter escort had failed. The only option left required putting the fighter inside the bomber and praying the hook held. FICON got its funding increase 31 days after the TomTom crash. What does it feel like to fly a jet fighter into the belly of a bomber at 20,000 feet? The pilots who did it described the approach in terms that sound more like surgery than aviation. You throttled back to 230 knots, agonizingly slow for a swept-wing jet, right at the edge of mush where the controls got soft and the airframe started telling you it wanted to stall. The B-36 above you blocked out the sky. Its 6 Pratt & Whitney R, 4 360 radials, and 4 J-47 turbojets threw a wake downward that buffeted your canopy like driving over railroad ties at highway speed. You smelled your own sweat and the sharp tang of JP4 fumes bleeding in through the cockpit seals. The trapeze hung below the bomber's belly, swaying slightly, a steel cradle with a receptor about the size of a dinner plate. Your hook had to find that plate. The margins bore repeating, closure rate under 2 feet per second, lateral drift under 6 inches. The crewman in the bomb bay, lying prone, face down through a plexiglass panel, gave hand signals: left, right, forward, hold. The RF-84K had no heads-up reference for vertical position. You judged it by how much bomber filled your peripheral vision and how badly the turbulence wanted to spit you sideways. A missed hookup meant pulling away, circling, burning fuel you couldn't spare, and trying again. 3 attempts sat as the unofficial limit before fuel state, forced to divert to whatever airfield you could reach, assuming one existed within range. The designation FICON stood for Fighter Conveyor, which ranks among the most aggressively boring names the Air Force ever assigned to something this dangerous. The acronym appeared in a 1952 proposal document from the Air Materiel Command. Somebody wanted to make a flying aircraft carrier sound like a baggage handling system. They succeeded. But that bureaucratic blandness masked what the 91st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron actually accomplished between 1955 and 56. Operating out of Fairchild and Carswell, FICON crews flew missions that remain partially classified 7 decades later. The after-action reports that have surfaced describe reconnaissance penetrations of Soviet-adjacent airspace, the periphery of denied territory, probing radar coverage, photographing installations that SAC needed mapped before any wartime strike package could be planned. 10 GRB-36 D motherships carried 10 RF-84Ks. The squadron flew over 100 parasite sorties. Not one RF-84K failed to rehook. Look at that number. Over 100 hookups at altitude, in weather, in turbulence, with a closure tolerance measured in inches and a perfect recovery rate. Captain Dale Quayle, who flew FICON missions out of Fairchild, recalled the moment of contact decades later. You'd hear the clank through the whole airframe. Then the trapeze pulled you up, and the bomb bay doors closed, and it got dark and quiet. You just sat there in somebody else's airplane, going home. He spent every approach certain the hardware could kill him, and every recovery grateful it hadn't. The reconnaissance product proved excellent. The RF-84K's cameras delivered imagery from altitudes and angles the B-36 alone could never have achieved. Lower, faster, sharper. SAC's targeteers got what they needed. The crews performed beyond any reasonable expectation, and the engineering held up under every sortie, and none of it mattered. By 1956, a Boeing KC-97 tanker could refuel a fighter in flight reliably enough to render the entire parasite concept obsolete. The hook, the trapeze, the bomb bay cradle, all of it solved a problem that aerial refueling solved cheaper, simpler, without requiring a pilot to thread a needle in a hurricane. The flying boom weighed about 1,000 pounds. A rigid telescoping pipe mounted under the tail of a KC-97 Stratofreighter, operated by an airman lying prone in a glass-walled booth, steering the nozzle into a receptacle on the receiving aircraft. No hook, no trapeze, no bomb bay doors grinding shut around your cockpit. Just fuel, transferred at 600 gallons per minute through a pipe that a single enlisted boom operator controlled with a pair of joysticks. Boeing had tested the concept as early as 1948. The early hardware leaked, froze at altitude, and disconnected without warning. One test flight over Edwards sprayed 300 gallons of JP4 across the belly of a B-50 before the boom operator could retract. But by 1954, the system worked. By 1955, SAC had enough KC-97s in the inventory to support operational fighter deployments across the Atlantic. An F-84F could take off from a base in England, hit a tanker over the North Sea, top off its tanks, and reach targets deep enough into denied airspace to accomplish what FICON had been built for. Without the bomber or the trapeze, without the crewman lying face down in a bomb bay, relaying hand signals through plexiglass. The cost comparison buried FICON before anyone had to argue about it. Modifying a single B-36 into a GRB-36D mothership ran approximately $1.2 million in 1954 money. Each RF-84K required its own hook installation, structural reinforcement, and specialized maintenance, another $350,000 per airframe. A KC-97 cost about $2.1 million to build from scratch, and it could refuel any compatible aircraft in the inventory. Not one specific fighter, any of them. The per-sortie economics favored the tanker by a ratio that made Pentagon comptrollers grin, and Pentagon comptrollers do not grin often. SAC's official program review from late 1956, the document that effectively ended FICON, uses language that reads almost apologetic. The parasite concept has demonstrated operational validity, it states, but cannot be sustained as a primary reconnaissance delivery method given the availability of aerial refueling assets. Operational validity. They confirmed the thing worked and canceled it in the same paragraph. The 91st Strategic Reconnaissance Squadron stood down its FICON capability in early 1957. The GRB-36Ds reverted to standard bomber configuration or went to the boneyard. The RF-84Ks had their hooks removed, got redesignated, and scattered across Air National Guard units where they flew out the rest of their airframe hours, doing things that didn't require hanging from another airplane's belly at 20,000 feet. What irritates me about how this story usually gets told, when it gets told at all. FICON shows up as a footnote, a curiosity sandwiched between flying saucers and nuclear-powered bombers on some weird aircraft listicle. The framing treats it as a failure. It didn't fail. Over 100 parasite sorties with a perfect recovery rate, 0 hookup losses, reconnaissance imagery that SAC's targeting staff actually used to plan nuclear strike packages against the Soviet Union. The program delivered exactly what it promised. A better mousetrap just came along faster than anyone expected. Sources conflict on whether any FICON missions penetrated actual Soviet airspace versus probing the periphery. The CIA's Project Genetrix, balloon-borne cameras launched over the USSR starting in January 1956, ran simultaneously and covered some of the same intelligence requirements. That overlap muddied FICON's legacy further. 2 classified programs chasing the same photographs, and the one that used a $30 million bomber as a taxi lost out to one that used weather balloons, costing about $2,500 apiece. The Air Force does not include this comparison in its official histories. Make of that what you will. The pilots dispersed. Grubaugh stayed in flight test. Quayle transferred to a tactical fighter wing and flew F-100s out of England. Most of the FICON qualified pilots never discussed the program publicly during the Cold War. The missions carried classification markings that didn't relax for decades. A handful gave interviews in the 1980s and 90s, careful about specifics and precise about the flying. One detail from Quayle's interview stands out. Asked what he did after his last FICON recovery, after the trapeze pulled him up and the bomb bay sealed and the B-36 turned for home, he said he pulled out a paperback and read for 3 hours. Couldn't sleep. Too much adrenaline. So he sat in a fighter hanging inside a bomber over the Arctic, reading a novel he couldn't later remember the title of, while somebody else flew him home.